Good day, everyone. We are now on part 2 of our reading and the important subject on the humiliation of Christ, taken from a book on synopsis of a purer theology, studies in medieval and Reformation traditions. Now, moreover, we state that while he did suffer punishment to the extreme degree, he did not suffer punishment for eternity. And in that suffering of the soul deep within Christ, what the scholastics call intrinsically, there was nothing inordinate when he was being assailed outwardly, what they call extrinsically. From this, it follows that he was not affected by that complete damnation wherein those people will abide who, because of their own sins, will be bound with punishments forever. Death of that kind is accompanied by the loss of all hope. Far be it from us to ascribe that kind of death to Christ, even if we should suffer from the insults of our opponents on account of it. In fact, along with John of Damascus, we refer everything that Christ suffered, whether in body or in soul, to what he called his oikeosis, or appropriation. The appropriation is not the natural or essential one, whereby he assumed our nature and all things natural, but it is personal and relative, whereby he immediately after that appropriated our person to himself, in which he made our curse and forsakenness his own, receiving our person. And we are not inclined to think that God was ever an enemy to the Son or angry with him. For how could he have been angry with his beloved Son in whom his soul delighted? Or how could Christ have reconciled the Father to others through his intercession if he were hostile to him? This was Calvin's clever retort to the slander he suffered for his teaching concerning redemption. From these words, it follows that people slander God for being unjust and Christ for being unwise when they dare to make the claim that the smallest droplets of Christ's blood, the tiniest teardrop, and the slightest groaning of the heart could have been enough to redeem the human race. By this backwards preaching about his worthiness, these people make every action superfluous that Christ performed over and above these, and they intimate that his death was not necessary, even though it did follow upon all of those sorrows of his heart and soul. It was in death that the real and not just apparent separation of the body from the soul of Christ occurred, a separation in the natural union, in its effects, and in its phase. Nevertheless, the hypostatic union of the two natures, which maintains the body and the soul, remains. For since we confess in the creed that the Son of God died and was buried, and these words cannot be said about him except concerning his human nature. Although what belongs to human nature or its parts is said about the Son of God only because of this union, it follows that even in death, the Word remained joined to the parts that were separated. We deny, however, that at the time of his death, Christ was a man in the restricted sense of the word, as the master of the sentences claimed by Peter Lombard in his Sentencia, book number 3, on distinction number 22. And we deny it because Christ truly did die. And it belongs to a man's death that upon dying he ceases to be a man or a living being, because the soul that completed the existence of both man and the living being has departed. For this reason, a man who has died is not simply called a man, but a dead man. with a qualification that brings in a new element while putting an end to what it defines. For we would not wish to concur with Apollinaris, who thought that the word was united with the body like form and substance, with which would ruin the essence of a real man. The true burial of Christ is premised upon his true death, as it was the self-same body of the one person in the grave. This body was not destroyed by being burned or resolved into its component elements, which John of Damascus calls dialysis or dissolution, and aphanismos or extermination. An exact exposition on the Orthodox Faith, Book 3, Chapter 28. Although it did cease to be a living body by the removal of the living form taken from Psalm 16:10 and Acts 2:27 and Acts 13 verse 35. Now, real death surely is the reason for burial, and that burial happened in a new grave, lest afterwards the story should be fabricated that someone else had arisen. Moreover, as God provided it, a seal and guards were placed over it, whereby the enemy foolishly and without any consideration sealed the veracity of his resurrection by rolling a large stone before the mouth of the cave, thus also putting a seal over any slanderous tongue. Of relevance here is the fact that the burial happened with the knowledge and permission of Pilate. For after the centurion had made an enquiry into it, the judge guaranteed the certainty of Christ's death by means of his public statement. So there can be no doubt about the facts that he had died. And it was for this reason also that, according to the dispensation of God's providence, were used in this affair who were not just from the common folks, but would perform this task for the most holy body, not in secret, but openly, so that everyone might know that no fraud was committed therein. The burial was followed by the confinement of Christ's body in the grave until the third day, during which time the Son of God lay there as though held fast by the mighty chains of death, defeated and lifeless, even though he would conquer death and break its chains asunder. Moreover, this 3-day confinement should be understood to mean that he had stayed in the grave not for 3 whole days and an equal number of whole nights, but for 2 whole nights, that is, the nights of the 6th and 7th days of that week, and 1 whole day, namely the Sabbath day. And therefore, we should understand what Matthew 12:40 writes about the sign of Jonah in a figurative sense. The Son of Man was in death's embrace for 3 days and 3 nights, like Jonah in the belly of the sea monster. For we call the final part of the natural day a whole day, which consists of day time and night time. And in this way, the Lord lingered in the grave only for 1 entire day and night, while parts are merely borrowed from the 2 other days. Having treated the passion, death, and burial of Christ, it follows that we should now investigate their causes. Of Christ's passion, there are remote and proximate efficient causes, and the proximate causes in turn are direct and indirect. The remote cause is God's eternal decree or divine ordination, which was from eternity arranging and guiding this matter, because it was not by chance or a fatalistic necessity, but by the decree of God the Father, and through a means that God's wisdom found to be very fitting. In a way, for Christ to endure those passions to redeem the human race, taken from the book of Acts chapter 4, verse 28. Now that ends our reading on part 2 of this subject on the humiliation of Christ under Christology. So part 3 commences next time. And I am hoping that you are very much excited hearing and viewing this particular subject the soonest possible time. Lord willing, we will see each other again and see you. Bye-bye.